The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she was gone. That was how her stepmother had arranged it. Quickly, with the efficiency of someone disposing of an unwanted thing before anyone could ask too many questions. There had been no farewell supper, no chance to walk through the rooms of Thornfield House one last time, no opportunity to take anything more than what fit into a single trunk. The solicitor had come on Wednesday morning. He had sat across from Sylvia at the writing table in the study, her father's study, with her father's books still on the shelves and her father's ink still in the well, and he had explained to her, with the measured patience of a man accustomed to delivering bad news, that the estate had passed entirely to her stepmother upon her father's death, and that her stepmother had arranged a position for her. Not a marriage, a position. As what? Sylvia had asked. The solicitor had cleared his throat. As a companion, he said, to the household of the Marquess of Dunhollow. She had not heard the name before. That in itself told her something. Her father had known nearly everyone worth knowing in the county, and he had never mentioned a Marquess of Dunhollow. She said as much to the solicitor, who only looked at his papers and said that the arrangement had been made through correspondence, that the Marquess's estate was in the north, and that a carriage would come for her on Thursday morning. Her stepmother had not been in the room for any of this. Sylvia had not seen her until that evening, when they passed each other in the upstairs corridor. The woman had looked at her with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite satisfaction, but something between the two. The look of someone who has moved a piece on a board and is already thinking about the next move. "You'll want to dress plainly," her stepmother said, "for the journey." Sylvia did not answer. There was nothing to answer. She packed the trunk herself that night, by lamplight, while the house settled around her in all its familiar sounds, the creak of the third stair, the rattle of the kitchen door when the wind came from the east, the low moan of the chimney in the old part of the house. She had been born in this house. She had learned to read in the room below her, sitting on her father's knee, with a book spread across both their laps. She had learned to play the pianoforte in the drawing room, badly, and then less badly, and then toward the end, well enough that her father would sometimes stop in the doorway to listen. All of that was gone now. Not the house. The house was still there, but her claim to it, her right to be in it, her name on anything within it. Her stepmother had seen to that with great care and greater speed, and the solicitor's quiet voice had confirmed it. She folded her dresses and set them in the trunk. She took the miniature portrait of her mother from the bedside table, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and tucked it into the corner beneath her winter coat. She did not sleep. The carriage came at 7:30. Sylvia was already waiting by the front door when she heard it on the drive. She did not look back at the house as she walked out. She had decided sometime in the long hours before dawn that she would not look back. It would not help anything, and it might break something in her that she needed to keep whole. Her stepmother was not there to see her off. That, at least, was a mercy. The journey north took the better part of 2 days. The carriage was not comfortable, and the driver spoke only to the horses. Sylvia watched the landscape change through the window, the familiar fields giving way to longer stretches of open country, then to rougher ground, darker hills, sky that seemed to sit lower and heavier than the sky at home. The north had a different quality of light. She noticed it on the second afternoon, when the sun came out briefly between clouds, and the moors turned a color she had no exact name for, something between gold and gray. Dunhollow House appeared at the end of a long, straight road lined with old oaks, whose branches had grown together overhead to form a tunnel of bare winter wood. It was larger than she had expected, larger than Thornfield House, larger than anything her father's circle had possessed, and built of dark stone that seemed almost black in the afternoon shadow. There were 4 chimneys visible from the road, all of them smoking. Someone was expecting her. The carriage stopped at the front entrance, and a woman came out before Sylvia had finished gathering herself. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned very neatly, and the particular upright posture of a housekeeper who has spent decades reminding herself and others that position carries its own form of dignity. "Miss Voss," the woman said. Not a question, she already knew who Sylvia was. "I am Mrs. Thorne. I manage the household." "How do you do?" Sylvia said. Mrs. Thorne looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind of eyes that had spent a long time watching people arrive and understanding them quickly. She did not say what she saw. "His Grace is not at home this evening," she said instead. "He's expected tomorrow. I'll show you to your rooms." The rooms were in the east wing, not servants' quarters, but not the guest rooms either, somewhere between, which told Sylvia something about how her position had been understood. Companion, the word covered a great deal of uncertainty. She set her trunk down and stood for a moment in the center of the room. It was clean, and there was a fire laid and lit, and the window looked out over a formal garden that was brown and sleeping now, but had the structure of something that would be beautiful in spring. She thought, very briefly, of her room at Thornfield House, and then she put the thought away. She was here now. This was what there was. She did not meet the Marquess until the following afternoon. Mrs. Thorne had given her a tour of the ground floor that morning. The long gallery, the library, the blue drawing room, the morning room. Moving through the rooms with the efficient manner of someone presenting inventory rather than hospitality. Sylvia listened carefully and looked at everything, because looking cost nothing, and she was trying to understand the shape of this place before she had to navigate it with a person watching. It was in the library that she stopped. The room was large and quiet, 3 walls covered floor to ceiling with books, a 4th wall given over to tall windows that looked onto the kitchen garden. There was a fire and 2 chairs drawn up to it and a writing desk in the corner. But what stopped Sylvia was not any of this. It was the portrait above the mantel. It was a woman, perhaps 40 in the painting, dressed in the fashion of 30 years past. She had dark eyes and a particular way of holding her chin slightly raised, as though she were listening to something just beyond the frame. The background was garden, a walled garden with roses. Sylvia had seen that garden before, not in a painting, in real life, in the walled garden at Thornfield House, which her father had planted for her mother the year they were married. She stood very still. "That is the late Marchioness, Mrs. Thorne said from the doorway. "His Grace's mother. She died some years ago." "Yes," Sylvia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I can see that." She looked at the portrait for another moment, and then she looked away, and she did not ask the question that was already forming. Not yet. The Marquess of Dunhollow was not what she had expected, which was a problem, because she had not expected anything in particular, and still managed to be surprised. He came into the entrance hall in the mid-afternoon, still in his riding coat, and Mrs. Thorne introduced them with the brisk efficiency of someone completing an administrative task. His name, she already knew, was Aldous Crewe. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be very quiet in his own body. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "You came from Thornfield." It was not phrased as a question, but it required an answer. "Yes," she said. "Your father was Gerard Voss." He was. Something shifted in his expression, not quite recognition, not quite something else. He said, "I'm sorry for your loss," and he said it the way people say things when they mean them, without the slightly elevated inflection that people use when they are performing sympathy. "Thank you," Sylvia said. He nodded once, and then he went upstairs, and that was the whole of their first meeting. She had been at Dunhollow House for 6 days before she found the letters. It happened by accident. She had been asked by Mrs. Thorne to make an inventory of one of the unused rooms in the East Wing, a task that seemed designed more to give her something to do than because the inventory was strictly necessary. And in the bottom drawer of a heavy oak writing desk, beneath a bundle of old household accounts, she found a packet of letters tied with green ribbon. She almost closed the drawer without touching them. They were not hers to read. They were old, and they were private, and they belonged to whoever had used this room. But then she saw the handwriting on the topmost envelope. She knew that handwriting. She had grown up watching it fill the pages of account books, sign documents, address the letters that went out from Thornfield House every week. It was her father's handwriting. She sat down slowly on the floor, right there beside the desk, not caring about the dust, and she untied the ribbon. The letters were dated over a span of years, the earliest nearly 30 years ago, the most recent not long before her father's death. They were addressed to someone called Catherine, and she read them with the particular care of someone who understands that they are reading something that will change things. Not romantic exactly, or not only romantic. They were the letters of two people who had known each other very well, and had continued to know each other across a long distance, and had trusted each other with the things that people only trust to paper when there is no one close enough to say them to instead. The Catherine in the letters was not named further, but there was a letter near the middle of the packet that contained a passage that stopped Sylvia entirely. Her father had written, "The child is well and growing fast. I have not told her about you, or about what you did for us, because I do not yet know how to explain it in a way she will understand. But I intend to when she is older. She deserves to know that she has more allies in this world than she knows." Sylvia sat with that letter in her hands for a long time. Catherine, the late Marchioness of Dunhollow, His Grace's mother, the woman in the portrait in the library, with the walled garden behind her. She did not know what to do with what she'd found, and so for a time she did nothing. She put the letters back, tied the ribbon, closed the drawer. She completed the inventory. She went down to supper. But something had changed in the way she moved through the house. She looked at things differently now. She looked at the portrait in the library and thought about the walled garden at Thornfield House, and wondered how long her father had known the Marchioness, and what she had done for them, and why no one had ever said a word to Sylvia about any of it. She began paying attention to the Marquess in a different way, not with the cautious watchfulness of someone navigating a new employer, but with genuine curiosity. He was quiet in the mornings and less quiet in the evenings. He rode every afternoon regardless of weather, and he came back from these rides looking more settled than when he left. He read in the evenings, not in the library, but in a small sitting room off the main corridor, which Mrs. Thorne told her had been his mother's room. He ate at the long dining table with the particular self-possession of someone who has eaten alone for so long that it no longer registers as solitude. He was, she thought, lonely, not in a way he would have named or acknowledged, but in the specific way of people who have constructed their lives very carefully around not needing anyone, and have been mostly successful, and still. On the 8th evening, he spoke to her. She was returning a book to the library's shelf. She had been borrowing from the shelves, cautiously, with Mrs. Thorne's permission, and he was already there, standing by the window with his back to her. She almost retreated, but he must have heard the door. "You've been in the East Wing," he said, without turning around. She hesitated. "Mrs. Thorne asked me to do an inventory of the old writing desk. It was not a question," she said, carefully. "I completed the inventory." He turned then. He was holding something in his hand, a small folded piece of paper. He looked at it and then at her, and his expression was the particular expression of someone who has decided to say something and is determining the precise shape of it. "There were letters," he said, "in the bottom drawer." She did not deny it. "Yes, you read them." A pause. "Some of them." He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, like someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is now at last watching it occur. He set the piece of paper down on the writing desk. "My mother knew your father," he said. "I gathered they were friends for nearly 30 years. She never told me exactly how they met. She said it was a long story and she would tell it properly when the time was right." He stopped. "She died before she found the time." Sylvia thought about the letter. She deserves to know that she has more allies in this world than she knows. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "My father said something similar." Something shifted in his expression. "What did he say?" She told him. She recited the passage as she remembered it, which was precisely because she had a good memory for words and had read that particular passage 4 times in the cold of the East Wing room before she put the letters back. When she finished, he was very still. "He wrote that," the Marquess said, not disbelievingly, more as though he were setting the words down somewhere in his understanding, finding the right place for them. "He did." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Will you sit down?" They talked for 2 hours that evening. Not about the practical things, her position, her duties, the terms of the arrangement her stepmother had made, but about the other things, the more difficult and more necessary things. He told her about his mother, how she had come back from a trip south when he was a boy, with a particular energy that he hadn't understood then but recognized now as having been about someone she'd helped, something she'd done. How she had kept a room for correspondence that she'd always said contained her most important friendships. How she had told him, in the last weeks of her illness, that there was a man in the South whose daughter might one day need a friend, and that if Aldous was in a position to be one, she hoped he would. He had been 22 when she said it. He had not known what to do with it, and so he had done nothing. For years. And then her stepmother's letter had arrived, and something in the phrasing of it had made him deeply uneasy. The particular way it had framed Sylvia, as though she were a parcel being redirected rather than a person. And he had agreed to the arrangement, but not for the reasons her stepmother would have assumed. Sylvia listened to all of this. She listened the way she had learned to listen in the long months after her father's death, when everything had required listening and very little had seemed to require speaking. When he finished, she said, "What did my stepmother tell you I was?" He was quiet for a moment. "A companion," he said. "And what did you think when you saw me?" He considered this with the seriousness she was beginning to understand, was simply how he considered things. "I thought," he said slowly, "that you were not someone who had been sent to be a companion. I thought you were someone who had been sent away." The words sat in the room between them. She had not expected to feel anything when she came here. She had packed all of that away, very carefully, in the hours before the carriage came. The feeling of the house she was leaving, the feeling of her name being attached to nothing, the feeling of her father's study, with the familiar smell of ink and old paper, and the particular quality of afternoon light through the east window. She had packed all of it and put it somewhere she could not easily reach. But she felt, at that moment, in the library at Dunhollow House, with the fire burning low and the portrait of the late Marchioness watching from above the mantel, something very specific. She felt seen. The next weeks were different. She was still the companion. That was still what the arrangement was called, still what Mrs. Thorne understood her to be. But the texture of the days changed. The Marquess began to consult her about small things. Which books might be worth cataloging, whether the formal garden had been left too long without attention, what she thought of the route between the house and the village. They were not important questions. They were questions asked by someone who wanted to know what she thought. She was cautious. She had been cautious for a long time, and it did not stop all at once. But she began to understand that he was not someone who required caution in the same way her stepmother had required it. He was not looking for weaknesses or gathering material. He was simply careful in his own way, and careful people, she had found, were generally worth being careful with in return. In the third week, she asked Mrs. Thorne about the walled garden. "It's been locked since the late Marchioness passed," Mrs. Thorne said, with the particular tone of someone stating a fact that is also a boundary. "Did she garden it herself?" "She did. Roses, mostly. She brought cuttings from various places she'd visited." The housekeeper paused, very briefly. "She brought cuttings from the south, 1 year. Said they were from a garden planted by a friend." Sylvia thought about the walled garden at Thornfield House, the roses her father had planted for her mother. She thought about the way the cuttings traveled from one place to another, from one garden to another, and how that was a kind of correspondence that didn't need paper. She said, "Is there a key?" She found the garden on a gray February afternoon, when the light was flat and the trees were bare and everything had the quality of suspended waiting. The key was exactly where Mrs. Thorne had said it would be, on a hook inside the kitchen door. The gate opened with more ease than she'd expected, given how long it had been closed. The roses were cut back to bare canes, brown and still, but the structure of the garden was intact, the 4 quadrants, the central path, the low box hedging that had been left to grow a little wild. She walked the path slowly. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was simply there. She was nearly back at the gate when she saw it. In the corner, half obscured by the overgrown box hedge, was a stone set low in the ground. Not a grave marker. The inscription was not a name or a date. It was simply a line of text, carved in plain, clean letters. "For what was given freely and received with gratitude." She crouched down to read it more clearly. The stone was old, older than the rest of the garden, or at least it looked that way. The carving was careful. Someone had meant it. She was still crouched there when she heard the gate. The Marquess came in and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the stone, and then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You found it," he said. "What is it?" He came and stood beside her. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My mother told me that she owed a debt that she could never properly repay, that it had been given to her early in her life, when she needed it most, and that the person who gave it had never asked for acknowledgement or return. She put that stone here so she would not forget." Sylvia looked at the inscription. "For what was given freely and received with gratitude." "Your father," the Marquess said, "when he wrote to my mother, the last letter, he wrote that he was concerned about what would happen to you after his death. He asked her to see to it, if she could, that you were not left entirely without resources." He paused. She had died by then. The letter arrived after her death. "I found it in her correspondence after I had agreed to the arrangement." Sylvia stood up. The cold had been sitting in her knees without her noticing. He wrote to her after she was already gone? He didn't know she had died. There had been no contact for some time. He had not wanted to burden her, I think, while she was ill. He looked at the stone. He was trying to protect you. He simply didn't know, by the time he wrote, that she was no longer able to answer. Sylvia thought about her father in the study at Thornfield House, writing a letter to a woman who was already dead. She thought about the care in that, the reaching out, the asking for help, the refusal to simply leave her to whatever happened. She thought about the fact that he had known, even then, that something might happen, and had still tried. She had thought, since his death, that she had been simply abandoned, first by his dying, which was not his fault, and then by all that followed, which had felt relentless and engineered. But he had tried. He had written the letter. She put her hand over her mouth for a moment. The motion was not dramatic. It was simply the body's way of managing what the voice was not yet ready to do. The Marquess did not look away, and he did not speak, and after a moment she lowered her hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I wasn't sure how." She nodded. The bare roses stood in their cut rows around them, and the flat gray sky sat overhead, and she thought, not for the first time, but with a new and particular quality, that there was something in this house that had been waiting for her before she knew she was coming, some thread that connected things she had not thought to look for. In March, a letter arrived from her stepmother. It was addressed to the Marquess, which told Sylvia everything she needed to know about what it contained. She did not see the letter herself. It arrived while she was in the garden, and she only learned of it from Mrs. Thorne, who mentioned it in passing with the careful neutrality of someone who has more to say and is choosing not to. She said nothing. She waited. That evening, the Marquess came to the library while she was reading. He sat down across from her without preamble, and he placed the letter on the low table between them, face down. "Your stepmother," he said, "has written to inform me that she has concerns about the appropriateness of your continued presence here." Sylvia set down her book. "I see. She suggests that if I wish to maintain a companion, she can recommend a more suitable candidate. That's very helpful of her." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and then was gone. "She also suggests that you may have given me a false impression of your circumstances and your character." "And what impression do you have?" He looked at her steadily. "That you are exactly who you are," he said, "and that anyone who arranged for you to arrive here the way you did, with one trunk and no farewells, understood very well that the arrangement they were making was not one you had agreed to or could refuse." Sylvia was quiet. He picked up the letter and placed it in the grate without looking away from her. The paper caught and burned quickly, the way old paper does. "I wrote to my solicitor last week," he said, "to make inquiries about the terms of your father's will and the nature of the arrangement that was made." He paused. "I should have done it sooner. I had a sense of things. But a sense is not the same as facts." "What did you find?" "That Thornfield House should have been held in trust for you until your 25th year," he said. "That certain arrangements your stepmother made in the weeks after your father's death are, I am paraphrasing Mr. Hartley, my solicitor, legally questionable at best." The fire had taken the letter entirely. There was nothing left of it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "My mother would have wanted to know that someone was asking the question," he said. "I did it for her, partly, and partly because—" He stopped with the particular way he had of finding the exact word. "I did not think you should be left to manage it alone." She thought about her father's letter, reaching across the distance to a woman who was already gone. She thought about the stone in the garden. She thought about arriving here with a trunk and no farewells and a word, companion, that had never quite fit. She said, "I have been trying to be careful." "I know," he said. "You're very good at it. I wasn't sure you could be trusted." He nodded, as though this were a reasonable position, which she supposed it had been. "I wasn't sure you would tell me anything true. I waited to find out, and—" "I found out," he said. The library was quiet around them. Outside, the first cold rain of an early spring was beginning to move across the moors, and the windows darkened, and the fire settled. Mrs. Thorne would bring the lamp soon. The evening had the particular quality that evenings began to have, she was learning, when the weather came in from the north and the house drew close around itself. She thought, "This is not what I expected." She had not expected, when the carriage came on that Thursday morning, to be anywhere that felt like this. She had expected something more like endurance, a place to occupy, a function to perform, a period of time to get through. She had not expected the portrait in the library, or the letters in the drawer, or the stone in the winter garden with its plain and patient inscription. She had not expected someone who would put a letter in the fire. Spring came gradually, the way it comes in the north. Not all at once, but in increments. A slightly warmer afternoon here, a few more minutes of light there. The roses in the walled garden began to show green at the tips of their cut canes. Sylvia went out most mornings to check on them. She did not know much about roses, but she was learning, which felt like the right approach. The Marquess often came, too, now, not every morning. He had his own routines and she had hers, and neither of them was inclined to interrupt the others. But more often than not, if she was in the garden, she would hear the gate, and he would come in, and they would walk the paths together without very much need to explain why. The solicitor came in April with papers. There were conversations that Sylvia was not present for, and then conversations that she was. Across the library table, with documents in front of her and the Marquess across from her, and Mr. Hartley at the end explaining things with careful precision. The legal situation was, he said, not unresolvable. It would take time, and it would take documentation, and it would not be without difficulty. "I have time," Sylvia said. Mr. Hartley had looked at her and then at the Marquess and then back at his documents. "Yes," he said, and left it there. Afterward, in the garden, she stood at the stone in the corner and read the inscription again, though she had long since memorized it. She was not sure what she was looking for. Perhaps just the presence of the thing, the fact that it had been put there by someone who had wanted to mark a debt that couldn't be marked in any ordinary way. She heard the gate, and she did not turn around. "Your father wrote to my mother," the Marquess said, coming to stand beside her, "because he trusted her with the thing he cared about most. I know. My mother kept his letters because she took that trust seriously. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the early birds in the hedgerow beyond the wall, the particular small sound of the garden beginning its day. She could feel the sun on her face, still thin and northern, but present. "I intend to take it seriously as well," he said. "Whatever comes next, the solicitor, the question of Thornfield, all of it. You won't manage it alone." She thought of the woman she had been on that Thursday morning, standing at the front door of Thornfield House with one trunk, and her back turned and her jaw set against looking back. She thought of the long road north, and the tunnel of bare oaks, and the dark stone house appearing at the end of it. She thought of the letter her father had sent to a woman who was already dead, because he had still wanted, even then, to try. She looked at the stone. "My father knew," she said, "that your mother would have helped him if she could. He knew that even when she was gone." She paused. "I think he also knew that the kind of people who put stones in gardens don't usually raise children who are entirely different from themselves." She turned then and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and still, but not closed. "He was right," she said. The garden held them for a moment in its bare and patient waiting. The roses not yet bloomed, the light still thin, everything in the slow work of becoming. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, the world was arranging itself into all its ordinary complications. The solicitor, and the papers, and the long unraveling of what had been done to her. There would be difficulty. There would be time. But the stone said what it said, and the letters were in a drawer in the east wing, and the roses were coming up green at the tips of the canes, and someone had put his mother's letter in the fire. That was what there was. It was, she found, enough to begin with.